So, the topic of mandated vaccines is continuing to be explored in the United States. And let's unpack a little bit what that means. We have a new article here. This one's out of Fox News. It says the DOJ declares vaccine mandates legal. So, we're here with David Helfrich, who's our resident legal expert, to explore what this means and really the discussion of mandated vaccines really in context here. So, David, why don't you discuss what is the DOJ saying here?
For sure. Good day to you, Joe, and everyone at the Pulse. Good to be with you all. So basically, what happened here, the Attorney General Merrick Garland and the DOJ, they presented a legal opinion that essentially says private companies and government agencies can require their employees to get vaccinated as a condition of working there. This is obviously narrowly focused to the COVID-19 vaccinations. Why this is interesting is because typically under federal law, the government cannot mandate these vaccines unless there's full FDA approval. Obviously, these vaccines have been approved under the EUA for emergency use authorization. So this presented a lot of legal questions and legal challenges that people had a lot of curiosity about. This opinion from the DOJ does sort of validate the government and Joe Biden's stance that they want to now go ahead and mandate vaccinations as a condition for employment, both for government agencies on the federal and state levels, and for private enterprises as well.
Right. And you mentioned Joe Biden. I mean, he's expected to make a statement. Here's another article out of CNBC that Biden is expected to announce he'll require federal workers to get the COVID vaccine or submit to rigorous testing. Has something like this ever happened before?
Well, I mean, it certainly has happened if you look at, what takes place in our schools and our hospitals. There's always a vaccine mandate, be it for measles, sometimes for other, we had this all the way back with polio. So there's precedent. This has happened before. What's different about this is, again, that we have a vaccine that has not gone through the full FDA approval process. But because we are in an emergency situation, the government is using those emergency powers to essentially bring forth this mandate to try to at least compel and mandate vaccination for federal employees, or private companies now, according to the DOJ, can also do this. But what is interesting and important here to remember is that individuals still retain the right to refuse. But because of this opinion, which I'm sure will be challenged in the courts, just because the DOJ presents this legal opinion doesn't mean that the Supreme Court can't come and maybe even circumvent or maybe even dissuade or disagree or dissent from this opinion. So, but what's interesting here is that even though individuals still retain the right to refuse, they may not have ironclad legal protection. So their remedy may be a lot more challenging, and there may be a higher bar for them to have legal protection because of this DOJ opinion.
Right. So let's break that down a little bit. You mentioned reasonable accommodation, with regards to refusing. Let's say someone does work for a business or even in for the federal government in some way, shape, or form. What does reasonable accommodation look like, and how would they go about attaining such a thing?
Sure. So reasonable accommodation is embedded in our civil rights laws. So essentially, when it comes to mandated vaccination, there is an exception for those who have a disability or a sincerely held religious belief. They are under the law entitled to what's called a reasonable accommodation. However, this reasonable accommodation cannot constitute what's called an undue hardship for the employer. So there's a lot of caveats and things that need to be unraveled there. But essentially what this means is that if you have a strictly held religious belief, if you have a disability, or if you have an allergic reaction or some kind of underlying health condition which prevents you from getting the vaccine, you are entitled to a reasonable accommodation. What this means in this context is that your employer will have to, maybe they require you to get tested. Maybe they require you to wear a mask while you're working. Maybe they're able to accommodate you and have you work remotely. These type of things are, the employer is required to at least make a good faith effort to provide this reasonable accommodation to those who have legitimate reasons to refuse the vaccine.
Right. And so it sounds like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's still going to be a lot of things that people might have to do regardless of if they refuse this. And even if they want to refuse and perhaps get let go from their job, or perhaps choose to leave and yet pursue a legal, maybe they try and sue their business or sue the company they were working for, it still sounds like it's going to be very tricky, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around whether or not there's going to be a legal standing for them to even sue. Is that about right now?
Absolutely. So because this is sort of uncharted territory, given that these vaccines have been rolled out under an emergency pandemic situation without full FDA approval, it is a very real prospect that some people may lose their jobs for exercising their right to refuse vaccination. That is a clear harm. That's a clear unfortunate situation, and obviously not a desirable outcome for a lot of people who want to keep their jobs but also do not want to get vaccinated. So for sure, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits down the pipeline. The courts are probably going to be inundated with various lawsuits, and it'll take some time to sort this all out. But for those people who refuse vaccination, there could be very real consequences coming in the very near future.
Right, and final question here. We're talking about mainly federal laws here. How does it differ if a state governor, for example, decides to say, at a state level, no businesses can, institute these type of laws? Do their powers overrule the federal recommendations?
So to some degree, yes, as everything with the law depends. Some state governments, by way of the executive, who is the governor of those states, are instituting executive orders to try to circumvent some of the federal policy. So for example, in a state like Florida or Texas or now New Hampshire, the governor there has instituted, I believe what's called a medical freedom initiative that says that residents of the state can't be required to be vaccinated against COVID-19 in order to access public facilities, benefits, or services. But it's important to note that even when governors do institute these executive orders, it still does not supersede state and federal law regarding vaccinations as a prerequisite for admission to schools or also hospital workers. It's important to note that they've always been required to be vaccinated against various viruses or various diseases that are out there. If you send your kids to public school, in all likelihood, unless they have a reasonable accommodation, or if they are one of the exceptions based on religious belief, allergy to the vaccine, they are likely vaccinated. So that still is in play, but a lot of states, by way of the executive and by way of the state legislature, are adamant to resist any sort of widespread mandate that would require people to be vaccinated in order to access public services.
Right, and then it seems too that there's almost like this cultural tension building that I wonder if almost in the era of cancel culture, whether or not people that are very adamant about vaccination might go after and pressure, big companies and businesses, don't support them if they're not mandating. Where do you see that type of cultural tension building, and how that might affect the way these companies move forward?
Yeah, the cultural tension is very real. It's palpable here in the US, as I'm sure it is everywhere else. You really have an ultra divisive environment where people are adamant about not getting vaccinated and people are adamant about others being vaccinated. And there's really not a lot of respect for people's individual rights here, which I think is problematic. There is going to be a lot of public pressure for, particularly, I think, children in schools once it becomes available. There's going to be a lot of pressure for people to access places like airports that they be vaccinated. And I think you're going to see this tension build up where you have those on one side who are more on the lines of respecting people's bodily autonomy and individual rights to make their personal medical decisions, versus those who argue that it's within the greater public good to get vaccinated because it is a proximate threat to everybody in society. This is going to play out. We're going to see this tension come head to head. And I think it's actually an ugly situation where people are just not respecting each other's right to make this decision for themselves, which I believe is a personal health decision that should be sort of sacred within people's bodily autonomy.
All right, well said. And as always, we appreciate your insight, David, and thanks for coming on.
For sure. Thanks, Joe. Good to be with you.